Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to you. The theme of my lecture tonight concerns paintings by Piet Mondrian which originate between 1963 and 1996, at least as far as we can ascertain on the basis of the dating on the pictures themselves. As you can see, these paintings are exhibited on the wall here behind me. What we have here are 6 paintings characteristic of one of the most important artists of this century, an artist whose name, rightly or wrongly, has become synonymous with the very idea of abstract art. However, before we proceed to an analysis of the paintings themselves, I think it might be a good idea if we listened to what Mondrian himself had to say about his art. Among various possible directions, says Mondrian, there are only 2 basic possible directions, horizontal and vertical. Among various possible light values, there are only 3 basic colors possible, white, gray, and black. Explaining how he arrived at these pictures, he says, in the first pictures, the space was the background. I began by marking out the forms in detail. Verticals and horizontals became rectangles, but they still appeared as forms separated from the background, and the color was still unclear. Feeling a lack of unity, I brought the rectangles closer. The space became white, black, or gray. The form became red, blue, or yellow. Linking up the rectangles corresponded to the expansion of the verticals and horizontals on the whole composition. It was clear that the rectangles, like all individual forms, stood out, and that therefore they had to be neutralized in respect to the composition. However, he goes on, the rectangles are never an end in themselves, but the logical consequence of lines continued into the space which determines them. They arise spontaneously from the intersection of vertical and horizontal lines. Otherwise, the rectangles, if they are applied on their own without adding some other form, do not appear as individual forms, because their contrast with the other forms does in fact cause a difference. Later, with the aim of cancelling the accentuation of the designs and rectangles, I abolished color and emphasized the border lines, intersecting them one over the other. Not only were the designs obliterated and cancelled, their relationship became more active. The result is an increase in expressive dynamism. Even in this case, too, I experienced how important it is to remove individual forms, which is the first preparation for universal construction. By continuing the process of abstraction, in which the large square predominates, 2 processes which will completely mature can be perceived. The first is the harmonious division of the surface, which is arrived at by reducing the whole surface to 2 succinct images, squares and horizontal and vertical rectangles, which arise from extending the peripheral lines. The other is the ever-increasing importance of lines as the main factor in the picture. Thus, the main and structural role of the line is emphasized. Its function is no longer to border a geometrical image, which is no longer closed, but appears in the form of open, spacious parts. And although it is negative, the background thus again gains importance. It will almost always be uniformly white or gray as a chromatic definition of the space. Well, that's what Mondrian himself has to say about his pictures, and it looks as though one couldn't add anything at all to that explanation. But is this, in fact, the case? The first thing that might seem extremely unusual to us is the very presence of Mondrian paintings here in this lecture hall. You may well be asking, how come we have so many Mondrians present in this room? I'm sure it must seem almost unbelievable to the majority of you. Now, if we could believe that for one moment, by some miracle, it had been possible to get original Mondrians for this occasion, we would soon be puzzled by the data we find on the paintings themselves. If you take a careful look at them, you can see that they do indeed carry Mondrian's signature. But the dating on them seems a little strange, to say the least. Namely, these pictures are dated 63, 79, 83, 86, 92, and 96. This means that the oldest picture is dated 1963. So what now? We know that Mondrian did in fact live from 1872 to 1944. We can assume that what we have in front of us are not original pictures by Mondrian. Even if we assume that, for some reason unknown to us, the artist himself dated or post-dated his pictures in this way, it would be possible to confirm by scientific analysis that these paintings did in fact originate after Mondrian's death. And that means that what we have in front of us are not paintings by Piet Mondrian. A new question therefore arises. Who is the real author of these pictures? We could, for example, assume that these are paintings done in the style of Mondrian by some contemporary painter who is unknown to us. But if you look at the literature, and you can take my word for this, you can establish that these are indeed faithful copies of a Mondrian original. Thus, these two, for example, are copies of a Mondrian in the National Museum in Belgrade. So, we can now assert with certainty that what we have in front of us are copies of Mondrian paintings done by some unknown author. And we must also not lose sight of the possibility that they could have been done by several authors. However, if we take into account that on the pictures themselves there are only the painter's initials and that there is no other data which could give us information as to who the real author is, then we must conclude that the answer, who is the author of these paintings, remains unknown. Now, if we can't answer the question, who has done these pictures, isn't it at least possible to answer the question, when did they originate? We have seen that the signature on these pictures does not necessarily point to the real author. And you can therefore understand why the dates, that is, the years on them, do not necessarily have to correspond to the actual date of origin. If the years 1963 or 1979 might still seem possible as dates of origin, what can we say about these two pictures, dated 1992 and 1996? I don't know if it makes sense to say this picture originated in 1996 or that it will originate in 1996. It's now already evident that the dating on these pictures can't be taken either as a reliable indicator of their time of origin. Thus, also left unanswered is the question, when did these paintings originate? If we don't know who did these pictures and when, would it not at least be possible to find an answer to the question, why have these pictures been made? Yes, why have they been made? We have already established very credibly that these paintings were not done by Mondrian himself. On the other hand, we do know that they correspond to pictures which Mondrian painted during his lifetime. This means that the pictures in front of us are some kind of copy. But why should someone copy Mondrian? We know that copying is not unknown in artistic tradition. One can still somehow understand copying the great masters of art to acquire artistic skills. But how could anyone imagine that by copying Mondrian, they could acquire such artistic skills? I'd hardly believe it was possible. Apart from this, if we look carefully at these copies, we will see that they certainly don't radiate artistic perfection. The author of these pictures seems to be completely untalented, so the reasons for their existence must be looked for elsewhere. And I think we can assume that the acquisition of painterly perfection is not the reason for their existence. Secondly, I think a reason understandable to all of us for copying Mondrian would be, it's clear why. Mondrian's paintings have acquired such value today that it might not be a bad idea to sell someone a copy instead of an original. However, as it is well known that copies made for the purposes of forgery can only with difficulty be detected through superficial analysis, it is clear why, on the basis of the dates on these pictures alone, that we can freely dismiss this possibility. In addition, we have already ascertained that these aren't really such perfect copies as could be used for the purposes of forgery. So, if these pictures did not originate for the purposes of acquiring artistic skills and were not made for the purposes of forgery, what then was the real purpose of their creation? After all, copying pictures such as Mondrian's in a way which shows that they are unambiguously copies seems completely senseless, especially because we know that in modern art, copying is not regarded as a particular virtue. Modern art does in fact insist on originality, authenticity, creativity. Being a modern artist means being new, unrepeatable, different from the rest. And copying is working directly contrary to this. Copying is a synonym for uncreativity, unoriginality, unimaginativeness. To say of some artist that he reminds us just a little of some other artists is tantamount to insulting him, especially if it's a question of direct copying. And that's completely understandable, because copying does represent a completely uninventive procedure. First, there exists the painting, which is chosen as a model. Then, within the limits of the possibility of the person who is doing the copy, the formal characteristics of the model are repeated. In this way, we will get a painting which is called a copy, while the model on which it is made is called an original. For pictures such as Mondrian's, this isn't such a big problem. But why then were these pictures created? Isn't it in fact extremely illogical to make copies of such simple paintings and such a well-known artist as Mondrian? If I had to answer this question, my answer would be in the affirmative. Yes, it's extremely illogical to even think of copying Mondrian. So what now? It looks as though we've reached the end of reason or the end of understanding, because I don't know how it will be possible to talk sensibly about the results of such a senseless procedure. Or perhaps it would be possible. Could we, for example, suppose that it is this very senselessness, this nonsense, that is the sense of the creation of these pictures? I ask myself, though, whether that solves anything at all. Is it then possible to say anything else about these pictures? Let's assume for a moment that, as an exercise, that senselessness was indeed the reason for their creation. Let us take this picture as an example. It's a copy of the Mondrian picture in the National Museum in Belgrade. We can see it every day when the museum is open. I'm sure that many of you who've had the chance to visit the museum will have noticed that it differs quite a lot from the other works exhibited in the same room. Let us now suppose that this copy is exhibited in the same museum, but in a room which corresponds to the period when these pictures appeared in public for the first time, because we have seen that we cannot rely on the dating of these pictures. This means that this picture would be displayed together with those originating from the 1980s. And so one nice sunny day we set out for the National Museum. And if that day doesn't happen to be a Monday and we arrive at a time when the museum is open, we will have the chance to look at its rich collection from prehistory to the present day. We will see some of the great names of modern art: Gauguin, Monet, Renoir, Matisse, Picasso, and of course we'll notice our Mondrian. And now, carried away by curiosity, we continue to follow through an exhibition which is non-existent as far as this particular museum is concerned, the dramatic developments and changes in modern art over the past decades. And we fail to recognize in the enthusiasm of our exploration that we've entered a room hung with masters of the 1980s. Suddenly, it seems to us that we've seen something familiar. Believing that there's been some mistake, we reject at first glance the very thought that we've already seen the picture we're looking at. We'll only think that the picture just seems familiar to us. In a state of doubt, we go up to the picture, and there's the Mondrian. We rub our eyes in disbelief. It's really Mondrian. And it's the very same one we saw several rooms ago, that is, several decades earlier. Still puzzled, but now with a chill in our hearts, not feeling quite as happy as we were before, we retrace our steps forward through time and accept with resignation the fact that the second Mondrian is still hanging where it was before. And suddenly we feel the earth begin to shake under our feet. We look at the wall and it's shaking too. The thought flashes through our heads, an earthquake. And immediately we realize how our beautiful edifice of history, change, progress is slowly but surely being shaken from its foundations and collapsing. With horror, we watch paintings, sculptures, all the masterpieces of our civilization crashing down together with the edifice. But what has happened with our Mondrian, the second Mondrian? It is completely still. It practically hovers in its non-existent place, as though untouched by everything going on around it. Well, that could be the consequence of such a senseless deed as copying Mondrian. However, we'll soon see that this isn't the only one. Let's continue our story. Let's assume that, by chance, we have survived this catastrophic earthquake, and that also, by mere chance, we have saved the very two pictures which interest us here. I'm sure you can guess which two pictures these are. Of course, the real, original Mondrian and its already legendary copy. We lift the original out of the ruins, shake the plaster off and the dust, and then we take the copy, which we will not have to clean for understandable reasons, and we take them home and hang them up in our modest little flat. Still shaken by the dramatic events of the preceding hour or so, we make a coffee, sit down on the floor, light a cigarette, and thus, thinking over everything that's happened, our glance absent-mindedly strays, as if by chance, to the wall where we've hung the pictures. And there, on a once white wall, hang the two Mondrians, the original and the copy. We'll not be at all surprised by their similarity. Formally, they are in fact the same picture. But we know that only one is an original. The other is, of course, a copy. The original is the painting that was done by Mondrian. It was created as a result of his interest in verticals, horizontals, the problems of space and design, primary colors, gray, black, red, yellow, and all this can be seen on our picture. Now we look at the copy, and everything in it is the same as in the original. The same colors, the same structure. But we can assert with certainty that the author, the unknown author of this copy, was not concerned with horizontals, verticals, structure, color. He was only interested in making a copy for reasons unknown to us. We have assumed that the only sensible reason for the creation of this picture is the senselessness of doing something like copying Mondrian. The object of his interest was only the copy and its relationship with the original. This means that in front of us we have two identical pictures, but that behind them stand two completely different ideas. While on the original painting we can see what the idea behind it is, this can't be said about the copy, because on the copy we still only see Mondrian. This means that the copy contains both the idea of its model and the idea of being a copy. Paradoxically, but it seems true, this results in the copy being more multi-layered and complex with regard to its meanings in relation to the original. And imagine, it almost doesn't differ from the original at all. Perplexed by all these considerations, you don't even notice how much time has passed. The cigarette has burnt out long ago, the coffee's already got cold, and you haven't simply even tried it. Really, it's quite unbelievable how two identical pictures can in fact be different. But that's not all. Let's come back to this lecture room and look at these two pictures. One is a copy of the Mondrian in the National Museum, which we've been talking about up to now. And this other one? You'll say that this is also a copy of a Mondrian in the National Museum. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Firstly, we don't know whether the same author made both copies. Perhaps these are two different copies by two different authors. If this is so, what mutual relationship would exist between these two pictures? And what relation would they have towards the original? And what if the case is quite different? If, let's say, the second author made a copy of the first author, a copy of a copy. What is the relationship between these two pictures then? And what is the relationship of this second copy with the original model? To be honest, I'm rather perplexed by all these questions. Even those so-called answers which we've arrived at in the course of this lecture are only conditional because they're based on assumptions and not on facts. The only true facts are these paintings that stand in front of us. Such simple pictures and such complicated questions. They rely neither on coordinates of time, nor on coordinates of identity, nor on coordinates of meaning. They simply hover, and the only comprehensible sense of their existence which we can accept are these questions themselves. Can we now imagine what good old Mondrian would have had to say about all of this? Instead of the problematic understanding of art as a reflection of the uncertainty of the human soul, he has this to say about the new plastic art. It is characterized by a certainty which does not pose questions, but offers answers. Man's consciousness clearly rejects the unconscious and expresses itself in art in a way which creates an equilibrium and thus precludes all question.